what do you think of my new hat? Now don't worry, I've not gone mad. Basically this is for an image where I'll just show you. Anyway, this video is about post-production, and more specifically, it's about file management. Now I know that sounds really boring, but good file management has been responsible for saving me from many tears over the past year or so, when I've lost files, a hard drive has failed, broken a hard drive, normally something to do with the hard drive. But before that, bad file management was the cause of much sorrow and sadness in my life. So if you take lots of photos and you want to use Lightroom and Photoshop and you want to store your files effectively, this is the way I do it. I'm not saying it's the best way or the most efficient way, it's the way that I've found that works for me, so it may be of interest to you. So this is basically how I take my files from my camera onto hard drives through Lightroom into Photoshop, and then back to Lightroom to finish, before dispersing it then into lots of different folders on my hard drives and on my desktop and on my phone. And yeah, it's about file management, so here goes. So first things first, I import my files onto an external hard drive in one of two ways. Either an SD card, like everyone does, or a tethering cable. If you're not familiar with tethering cables, basically one end of this connects to the camera, the other end connects to my laptop, and basically every time you take a photo, it saves directly to the hard drive that's connected to a laptop, versus saving onto a card. Now when I'm shooting for a specific concept, usually the first image I get for that concept is just captured on an SD card, and then I import to Lightroom via this. The reason for that is because the first image I get for a concept is usually in a city, or on top of a mountain, or in a field somewhere, or somewhere where it's likely to be raining sideways or my laptop would get robbed. The reason that one of those images, or in this case the gherkin, is always taken first when I'm putting together a concept is because, as a rule, I like to take the image that I have the least control over first. So with the gherkin, for example, I have pretty much no control over the light, the direction, or the hardness, or anything like that, unless I was to camp there for days and weeks. And even when it comes to perspective, I'm quite limited by streets and other buildings and traffic and stuff. So if I can get that image first, then I can mold any subsequent images to that building, rather than trying to mold the image of the building to the images that I get second. Does that make sense? So when I'm using the tethering cable, it's usually for supporting images for a concept. In this case, images like the shower cap. I didn't actually use this for the shower cap image. I probably use this half the time when I'm getting the supporting images. When I do use it, it's really good because I've got my laptop there as a reference when I need to look at the other original file that I took to try and match the framing and the perspective and the light. If I don't use this, then what I typically do is take the image of, in this case, the gherkin, put that on my phone, just so that when I'm framing up I have a reference of it on my phone. Because when you're trying to match images together, it's really just a guessing game. That, as far as I know, there aren't any tools on the market that can tell you exactly when you've matched the perspective and the light. So having a reference image is pretty important because you need to do it all by eye. Anyway, SD card and tethering are the two ways I import images onto hard drives via Lightroom. Quick note about backing up. So when I'm importing my images, typically they'll just go onto an external hard drive like this. Then within a day or two, I'll copy those files onto another hard drive, and only when I've got at least 2 copies of the files on different hard drives that are stored in different places will I delete my camera's memory cards. As you can see, this is a Nikon DSLR, and like most cameras of this size, it has 2 card slots. And I always set my cameras up to record to both cards. So anytime I take a picture on this camera, it records to the slot 1 and slot 2. And these are only deleted when I've got at least 2 copies on external hard drives. Still with me? So I've got my images into Lightroom, and now it's a case of choosing the ones that I want to go forward with. So when I've got my original image, in this case the gherkin, as is fairly typical in this scenario, I've got 3 or 4 different perspectives that I might want to consider for going forward. And when I've got my images into Lightroom, I'm basically looking for the best options. So I star the ones I like most, I enable profile corrections, I remove any chromatic aberrations, and I fix up the white balance. And that's pretty much all I do initially. When I think I've settled on a favourite initial image, then I commit to doing the shoot for the second photo. And when I've got that initial image, I'll save that as a TIFF and put it onto a working folder on my desktop. Now, a lot of photographers I know prefer to just enter Photoshop directly from Lightroom with a Lightroom file. I prefer to store a copy of images onto my desktop for a couple of reasons. A, it's another backup, but B, I tend to work in cafes and on trains and just out and about quite a lot. And any scenario where I can decrease the amount of kit I need to get out and stick on a desk or a bench or wherever is beneficial to me. So if I can just have the images on my desktop, then I don't need to worry about an external hard drive. And also, depending on your Photoshop preferences and how full your drives are, Photoshop can work a little bit better if you've got quick internal drives and you've got files referenced there. I think that's right. Tell me if I'm wrong. It is dependent on preferences. So when I'm shooting for the second image, even though I've nailed down the exact first image that I want to go for, I always try and get 5 or 6 different perspectives of the second image. And that's because, as I said before, it's really just a guessing game and you're doing it by eye. So if you can get a few different options in terms of perspective and framing and light for the second image, chances are that you'll be able to nail it in post. So now it's time to open up the background image in Photoshop. So I go ahead and do that from the working file on my desktop. I check if there are any corrections I need to make in Camera Raw, and I open the file. Then I go to Place Embedded and I opened up the second image. I make sure it's on top of the original image and I lower the opacity to 50% to check how good a match it is. Now, in most cases, I just lower the opacity to 50%. You might get a slightly better result if you play around with the blend mode sometimes, but more often than not, I just lower the opacity to try and check what a good fit the image might be. If I can see that the perspective just isn't right and no amount of transforming or moving or resizing is going to help, then I'll go down the list in the working file of the other images that I got. If it is a good fit, then I'll get to work. Now, it's really important that before I do any transforming or moving of this second image, that I make sure it's a smart object. Now, I've spoken about smart objects before in other videos, I think. Basically, smart objects are great for lots and lots of different things, but one of the main things they're good for is that if I was to decrease the size of this second layer, and then later on I decide I need to increase the size of it, if it's not a smart object, then I'll lose detail. If it is a smart object, then no matter how much I shrink the image, it will save the detail in case I want to blow it up to its original size later on. Anyway, this isn't an editing tutorial. I showed you the edit before. I guess this is like a ready, steady cook. Here's one I made earlier. So when I'm finished in Photoshop, there are a couple of things I do before moving back into Lightroom. Number one is I save the file with all the layers still intact as a TIFF into a masters folder on my external hard drive, which is just a catalogue of all of my images, basically. So if in future I spot a mistake or I want to make improvements or changes, it's not a problem for me to do that. The second thing I do is then make a layer that's comprised of all the visible layers, duplicate that onto another file and save that as a TIFF in the working folder on my desktop. Then when I go back into Lightroom, I sync that working folder, and that is the image that I'll do my final tweaks in Lightroom. Now, a lot of photographers I know love to use presets. Presets are really useful for photographers in lots of different industries. For example, if you're a wedding photographer, you're going to supply your client with a body of work that comprises of hundreds of images, and using presets to make them look in some way similar can tie them together quite nicely. In the work I do, each image is its own individual project, and rather than use presets, I prefer to manually adjust the sliders because I don't really need to worry about keeping a constant aesthetic through any different images. I think I can get more out of an image if I just go from scratch than if I was to automatically stick a preset on it and go from there. The other thing I'll say about Lightroom at this stage is that you shouldn't go anywhere near the sharpening tool. I love Lightroom. I think most of the tools are fantastic. The sharpening tool is not one of them. As I've said in other videos, I do all my sharpening like most people, just with a high pass filter in Photoshop. I think that's the way you should still go. I don't think there's anything that beats that quite yet. So yeah, stay away from the sharpening tool in Lightroom. But in this instance, I'm pretty happy with that image. And now it's just a case of exporting to a few different places. So typically I'll export a full TIFF to a folder full of full TIFFs. I'll also export a full-size JPEG. I'll export a JPEG that's the right size for my website. I'll export a JPEG that's the right size for Instagram and other social platforms, and a few others that aren't coming to mind. And that's it really, that's pretty much the process of how I deal with my files from start to finish. A quick note on cataloguing. So when I'm importing my files to Lightroom, up until, I don't know, maybe about a year ago, I used to do it on a project by project basis. So if I had an idea for a concept and I went and got the first images for that concept, I would put those files in a project folder specifically for that concept. Then a couple of weeks later, I'd get the supporting images for the concept. They would also go into that file. A couple of problems with that system started to emerge when either I would change the name of the project in my head halfway through editing it because I thought something else worked better, and that meant that when I went back to it a few months later, I couldn't remember what I'd originally called the project and it would just take me ages to find it. And the second was that a lot of the time I would go and shoot images without any specific project in mind yet, and what that meant was that I'd just dump those images into a generic bin that wouldn't really get looked at again because it was just full of random crap, and so that didn't work that great either. So now all my images are catalogued by date, and I think that works a lot better. I got told for quite a while that I should do that and resisted it, and I wish I hadn't resisted it at all, because it's a much better system. Oh, and one other thing actually, I think I'll do a quick little video on how to add rain in Photoshop, because it's a really cool little trick, and it's actually really simple. And as a side note, if you've seen my images on Instagram or on my website or whatever, and there's anything that you would like to know how I did, or in fact there's anything you'd like to know how to do in Photoshop that you've seen other people do, leave a comment below and maybe I'll make a video out of it, because I think this is maybe my 15th or 16th video, and I feel like I'm running a bit low on ideas, so that would actually be super helpful. But I'll kick off with a rain one. Anyway, I think that's it. Thank you very much for watching.